The Ming army did not lose a decisive battle in Vietnam. It lost its sense of direction. What began as a campaign to restore imperial control slowly turned into something else entirely. Orders stopped making sense. Commanders disappeared. And soldiers kept marching forward without knowing what victory even looked like. This is not the story of a single ambush. This is the story of how a great empire's campaign collapsed, step by step, in 1427. The Ming Dynasty entered Vietnam believing the outcome was already understood. From the imperial point of view, this was not an unknown challenge. The empire had faced distant provinces before, and order had eventually been restored. Large armies could be mobilized. Supply routes could be extended. Authority, once reasserted, would bring resistance back under control. Vietnam was seen as difficult terrain, but not an unsolvable problem. Distance was inconvenient, not dangerous. Local resistance was expected, but temporary. This campaign was never framed as a struggle for survival. It was framed as administration by force, a task to be completed, not a war that required adaptation. That assumption shaped every decision that followed. It encouraged scale over flexibility, numbers over coordination, confidence over caution. But deep inside unfamiliar valleys and fragmented terrain, those assumptions began to lose contact with reality. Not all at once, not dramatically. At first, the system still functioned. Troops moved. Orders were issued. The campaign continued forward. But beneath the surface, something critical was missing. The empire believed it was in control. In reality, it was about to discover how fragile that belief could be. The campaign did not begin to fail because the Ming army lacked strength. It began to fail when it lost its center. A relief force moved south with a clear purpose: to stabilize the situation, restore coordination, and reassert imperial authority. As long as command remained intact, the campaign still appeared manageable. But deep inside the mountain corridors, that structure was suddenly removed. The commander was gone. With that loss came more than confusion. It removed the single point where information, authority, and decision-making converged. Orders were no longer unified. Plans were no longer shared. Each unit began operating with only fragments of the larger picture. The army did not collapse at this moment. It continued to move, but it no longer moved with direction. Some forces advanced cautiously, unsure of what support existed ahead. Others slowed, waiting for instructions that would never arrive. What remained was momentum without coordination, movement without purpose. At this point, the campaign was still alive on paper. Troops were present, supplies existed, but strategically, something essential had been lost. The campaign no longer had a single mind guiding it. And without that center, every decision that followed would carry uncertainty, even before the next setback occurred. Armies can endure hunger. They can endure exhaustion. They can even endure defeat. What they cannot endure is uncertainty. After the loss of centralized command, instructions no longer carried the same weight. Messages arrived incomplete, delayed, or contradicted one another. Decisions were made in isolation, without a clear understanding of the wider situation. Some units were told to advance. Others were told to hold their ground. A few received no instructions at all. Each choice felt dangerous. Moving forward risked isolation. Standing still risked being surrounded. At this stage, the Ming army was no longer reacting to an enemy's movements. It was reacting to confusion within its own system. Momentum slowed. Confidence eroded. Coordination became guesswork. The campaign still existed in name, but not in practice. What had once been a coordinated operation was now a collection of disconnected movements, each focused on immediate survival rather than strategic purpose. This was the moment when the war changed character. The Ming army was no longer fighting to restore control. It was fighting to avoid collapse. And once a campaign reaches that point, every setback that follows carries far greater weight than before. Once coherence was lost, every problem became heavier than it should have been. Units could no longer rely on one another. Positions that once made sense within a larger plan now felt exposed and isolated. Support was uncertain. Reinforcement was no longer guaranteed. Small setbacks began to accumulate. A delayed movement here, a missed connection there. A position abandoned not because it was lost, but because it could no longer be held with confidence. What made these losses dangerous was not their scale, but their meaning. Each one reinforced the sense that the campaign was no longer moving toward a clear objective. Soldiers began to ask questions that had no answers. Why are we still advancing? What are we trying to secure? What happens if we push forward and no one follows? When those questions remain unanswered, discipline weakens in a quiet but irreversible way. Not through panic, but through hesitation. This was not a battlefield collapse marked by chaos and flight. It was a structural breakdown. A campaign designed to function through authority and coordination was now operating without either. At this point, the outcome was no longer shaped by enemy action alone. It was being shaped by the momentum of collapse itself. By the time the remaining Ming forces converged near Shuangjiang, the campaign had reached a critical threshold. This was no longer a question of how to regain control. It was a question of whether control was still possible at all. The situation offered no clear paths forward. Advancing deeper carried the risk of isolation. Holding position promised nothing but attrition. Retreat, once an option, now appeared fragmented and uncertain. Every decision led to loss. Only the scale differed. What made Shuangjiang decisive was not the size of the engagement, but the absence of alternatives. There was no maneuver that could restore coordination, no concentration of force that could rebuild confidence, no action that could reverse the structural damage already done. At this point, the campaign was still active in form, but it had ceased to exist as a coherent strategy. Shuangjiang marked the moment when the Ming army realized that continuing forward no longer meant pursuing victory. It meant prolonging a collapse that could no longer be controlled. Empires do not withdraw easily. They withdraw when the cost of continuing exceeds the meaning of the war itself. By this stage, the Ming campaign in Vietnam had become expensive, unstable, and strategically hollow. Troops were still present, supplies still existed, but the logic that justified their presence had disappeared. Victory no longer promised control. It promised only further uncertainty. Every additional movement increased risk without restoring coherence. Every attempt to reassert authority exposed how little authority remained. Under those conditions, negotiation was no longer a sign of weakness. It was a recognition of reality. Leaving was not an admission that the empire lacked strength. It was an admission that strength alone could no longer solve the problem it faced. The campaign had begun as an effort to impose order. It ended with the realization that order could not be restored at an acceptable cost. When that realization becomes unavoidable, empires do not fall in battle. They step away to preserve what remains of their power elsewhere. Empires rarely collapse in a single moment. They collapse when distance begins to erode control, when uncertainty replaces clarity, and when the purpose of war no longer justifies its cost. In 1427, the Ming army did not simply withdraw from Vietnam. It reached the limit of what power alone could achieve. The campaign ended not because the empire lacked strength, but because strength could no longer restore meaning, direction, or coherence. History would repeat this pattern many times after. In different places, under different flags, not as a lesson about who wins battles, but as a reminder of why even the strongest empires eventually lose wars. Thank you for respecting history. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and write the bell so you don't miss any battles.